Why was everyone staring at her? The silence in that dining facility wasn't normal. It was the kind of silence that comes after something unforgivable. Chief Warrant Officer Anna Sharma sat alone, 2 tables away from where the senior officers claimed their territory. Her uniform was perfect, every crease sharp, every detail exact, but she didn't take up much space. She never did. That's what made what happened next so shocking. Her focus was on the tablet propped against a salt shaker. Complex cascades of data scrolled past. Signal intelligence, the language of the invisible war, the war most people on that base didn't even know was happening. Her patch was unusual, a dark circle, almost black, with a stylized phoenix rising from static. Below it, in thread so gray it was nearly invisible, the words, "Faith in the antennas." Most soldiers walked past her every day without knowing what that patch meant. Most didn't know her unit even existed. She preferred it that way. Quiet, invisible, effective. That's how she worked. That's how she'd always worked. But invisibility has a price. When you're quiet, people assume you're weak. When you're focused, they think you're arrogant. And when you're brilliant at something they don't understand, they resent you for it. The fragile peace shattered when Brigadier General Marcus Thorne walked in. He didn't walk like a guest. He walked like he owned the place. His chest was covered in ribbons. Ribbons earned in staff appointments, far from any real danger. His jaw was always set in that pose of command. The look of a man who'd spent more time in conference rooms than combat zones. He spotted her immediately. And something about her quiet focus, her refusal to notice his arrival, seemed to offend him. "Look at this," his voice boomed across the room. He gestured toward her with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "The nerds have left their caves." His entourage of majors laughed right on cue. "What is it, Chief? The Wi-Fi go down in your little clubhouse?" She didn't look up. Her fingers continued tracing patterns on the screen. This wasn't the first time. Thorne had a special disdain for people like her, technical specialists, the ones who dealt in information warfare instead of infantry tactics. He couldn't comprehend what they did, so he mocked it. He strode to her table. His shadow fell across her work. "I'm speaking to you, warrant officer." Her eyes lifted slowly, calm, analytical, the eyes of someone assessing a variable, not a superior officer. "General," her voice was low, empty of inflection. The lack of the flustered apology he expected was gasoline on a fire. "When a general officer addresses you, you get to your feet," he snapped. "You show respect. Is that concept too complex for your algorithms to process?" She remained seated. "My work is time-sensitive, sir. I am monitoring a developing threat profile." He scoffed. Loud, theatrical. "A threat profile? You're probably watching cat videos. I've seen your reports. Incomprehensible garbage." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl that everyone could still hear. "You Spectrum warriors are a drain on the budget. A jobs program for people who couldn't pass a real infantry course." Then he said something that changed everything. "You hide behind your screens because you're afraid of the real world." He reached down and with one swift, contemptuous motion swept her tablet off the table. It clattered to the floor. The screen splintered. She watched it fall. Her face remained perfectly neutral. Then she looked back at him. The absolute stillness in her eyes was more infuriating than any defiance. He saw it as a challenge. It was the serene, infuriating calm of someone who refused to be rattled. And in a flash of ego, born of anger and an audience, his hand came up. It wasn't a punch, it was something more insulting. A backhand slap. The kind you'd use to dismiss something beneath you. His knuckles connected with her cheek, the crack echoed. Her head turned slightly from the impact. The dining facility went dead silent. Every fork stopped moving, every conversation died, every eye locked on the scene. For a moment the only sound was the drone of the air conditioner overhead. She slowly turned her head back to face him. No anger, no fear, no tears. Just a faint red mark blooming on her cheek, a stark contrast against her olive skin. Her eyes were unchanged, still assessing. She blinked once, slow, deliberate, the internal lens of her memory recording every detail, the angle of the strike, the faces of the witnesses, the precise time on the wall clock, the glint of light off his West Point ring. Thorne suddenly became aware of the dozens of stares. A flicker of unease crossed his face, but his arrogance quickly buried it. He had asserted his authority. He had put the quiet little technician in her place. He stood tall, puffing out his chest. "Let that be a lesson in military bearing," he declared to the room, though his voice was a shade too loud. Then he turned and walked to his corner, his majors following like obedient shadows. She didn't watch him go. She bent down with a fluid, economical movement and retrieved her tablet. The screen was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from the impact point. She ran her thumb over the broken glass, her expression unreadable. Then she rose, placed her tray on the return rack, and walked out. She didn't hurry. Her footsteps were measured, even. She didn't go to the medical station. She didn't go to file a complaint. She went directly to her facility. A windowless container complex on the far side of the base, ringed by its own security perimeter. Inside, the air was cold. It smelled of ozone and clean electricity. The hum of servers filled the space. She sat at her terminal, the one connected to a hardened, closed-loop network that had no connection to the outside world. Her first action was deliberate. She activated the small, nearly invisible body camera embedded in the frame of her eyeglasses. It had a 12-hour buffer. She spooled the recording back, isolating the 45-second clip from the dining facility. She saved it to 3 separate encrypted servers, each in a different geographic location. The chain of custody was pristine. Next, she accessed the base security network. She pulled the high-definition footage from 2 cameras in the dining facility, one over the serving line, one over the exit. Both had a clear view of the incident. She cross-referenced the timestamps with her own recording, creating a synchronized, multi-angle record of the event. Then she began to type. Her report wasn't emotional, it wasn't a complaint, it was a statement of fact, as dry and precise as an after-action report. Time 13:07 Zulu. Location DFAC FOB Sentinel. Subject Brigadier General Marcus Thorne. Action unprovoked physical contact. Details: subject approached my station, initiated verbal confrontation, escalated to physical contact, open hand strike to left cheek after I failed to comply with an order to stand while engaged in time-sensitive monitoring, physical damage to government property, minor physical injuries sustained, all relevant data logs, including audiovisual recordings from multiple angles, secured and archived. End of statement. She filed the report electronically through her unit's secure channel, flagging it for her direct superior, a man 3,000 miles away at the National Security Agency. She didn't file it through the base command structure. She knew that would be useless. It would be buried by Thorne's staff before it ever saw daylight. She was using her chain of command to fix a problem in his. After sending the report, she sat back. She closed her eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion, in calculation. She had set something in motion, something irreversible. But there was no satisfaction on her face, no sense of victory, just the calm of someone who had executed a procedure correctly. What she didn't know yet was that her report had landed in the inbox of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. A man who understood that the future of warfare wasn't about who could yell the loudest. It was about who controlled the information. And Anna Sharma was about to teach an entire command structure a lesson they would never forget. 3 days passed. Nothing happened, at least nothing visible. Thorne continued his routines. Briefings, inspections, dinner at his corner table. He'd already forgotten about the incident, or so it seemed. But across the base, whispers had started, quiet conversations in the shadows, questions about what happened in the dining facility, about whether anyone had reported it, about whether anyone would dare. Sharma went about her work, monitoring signals, analyzing data. She spoke to no one about the incident. She didn't need to, the facts would speak for themselves. On the 4th day, something changed. Thorne received a message, a priority communication. He was to report immediately to the command center. When he arrived, the atmosphere was different, cold, formal. Waiting for him was a full colonel from the Judge Advocate General's office, a woman with sharp eyes and a file folder that looked ominously thick. "General Thorne," she said, not offering her hand. "We need to speak privately." What happened in that room over the next hour would become the subject of intense speculation. But the basics were this: Thorne was shown the evidence. The body camera footage, the security camera recordings, the synchronized multi-angle view of him striking a subordinate officer, the detailed report, the pristine chain of custody, every single regulation he had violated laid out in clinical detail. He tried to explain, tried to justify, tried to claim she had been insubordinate, disrespectful, that he was simply correcting a discipline problem, but the JAG colonel stopped him with a single sentence. "General, we have recordings from 6 different angles. Would you like to review them again?" His face went pale. He realized in that moment that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed that his rank, his connections, his years of service would protect him. He had forgotten the first rule of modern warfare. Everything is recorded, everything leaves a trail, and the people who control that information hold more power than any general. The investigation moved quickly, too quickly for his staff to contain. Within a week, charges were filed: assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, destruction of government property. The list went on. Thorne's world collapsed in slow motion. His command was stripped, his staff scattered, and he was confined to quarters, pending a court-martial. But that wasn't the end of Anna Sharma's story. It was just the beginning. How do you humiliate someone who's never needed validation? That was the question that haunted Thorne's former staff as they tried to make sense of what had happened. They'd assumed Sharma would want revenge, would want to see him suffer publicly, but she had done something far more devastating. She had simply documented the truth and let the system enforce its own rules. No drama, no speeches, no grandstanding, just facts, and that quiet precision was terrifying. Because it meant she could do it again, to anyone, at any time. A month after the incident, Sharma received new orders, not punishment, not reassignment to some backwater post, an invitation. She was to report to a naval vessel, the USS Vigilance, for a classified wargame exercise. The details were vague. All she knew was that it involved testing the Navy's command and control systems against simulated cyber threats. She arrived at the ship on a gray morning. The sea was restless, the waves chopping against the hull. She was escorted to a secure compartment deep in the vessel's interior. Inside, she found a team of Navy officers, Rear Admiral Vance at the head of the table. He was a quiet man, the kind who observed more than he spoke. He looked at her for a long moment, then gestured to a seat. "Chief Sharma," he said, "I've read your file, all of it, including the incident at Sentinel." Her face remained neutral. "Sir, I want you to understand something," Vance continued. "This exercise isn't just about testing systems. It's about testing people, about seeing how they respond when their assumptions are challenged." He slid a folder across the table. "Your role in this operation is simple. You're going to break our network completely. You're going to show us every vulnerability, every weakness, every flaw in our command structure. And you're going to do it in a way that can't be ignored." She opened the folder. Inside were schematics, network diagrams, lists of protocols and security measures. It was a challenge, a test, and also, she realized, a statement. Vance was giving her a platform, a way to prove that the kind of warfare she specialized in was just as critical as any traditional combat operation. The war game began at midnight. The ship went into full operational mode. Simulated threats appeared on radar screens. Orders flew through the chain of command. And somewhere in the depths of the vessel, Sharma sat at a terminal, her fingers moving across the keyboard with surgical precision. What happened over the next 72 hours would become legend in naval intelligence circles. She didn't just break into the ship's network. She took it over, completely, silently. She rerouted communications. She altered sensor data. She made weapons systems report false statuses. She inserted herself into the command structure so seamlessly that officers were following orders from her terminal without realizing they weren't coming from the admiral. But here's what made it truly devastating. She didn't crash anything. She didn't cause chaos. She simply made the ship believe it was functioning perfectly while she controlled every aspect of its operations. It was a ghost in the machine, invisible, undetectable, absolute. On the bridge, confusion slowly turned to panic as officers realized they had lost control, not to some external enemy, but to someone already inside their systems. someone who understood their procedures better than they did. When Vance finally called a halt to the exercise, the silence was deafening. He stood on the bridge, surrounded by his staff, and asked the question everyone was thinking. Where is she? They found her in the server room, sitting calmly, a cup of coffee cooling beside her keyboard. She looked up as they entered. "Exercise complete, Admiral," she said simply. "Full report uploaded to your secure terminal." Vance stared at her. Then he started laughing, not mockery, genuine, amazed laughter. "Chief," he said, shaking his head, "do you have any idea what you just did?" "Yes, sir. I demonstrated 17 critical vulnerabilities in your C4I architecture. Recommended patches are included in the report." "You did more than that," he said, his voice growing serious. "You just proved that the most dangerous weapon in modern warfare isn't a missile, it's information, and the people who control it." The debriefing took days. Sharma walked Vance and his staff through every step of her infiltration, every backdoor she'd exploited, every assumption she'd weaponized. She wasn't gloating. She was teaching, showing them how an adversary with her skills could cripple an entire fleet without firing a single shot. The respect in the room was palpable. These were officers who had spent decades at sea, who had commanded ships in combat. And they were listening to a warrant officer half their age explain how she had rendered their entire command structure obsolete. But something else happened during that debriefing. Word spread. Through secure channels, through quiet conversations, through the invisible network of military intelligence professionals. The story of Anna Sharma, the woman who had been struck by a general and responded not with anger but with evidence. The woman who had dismantled a Navy war game with nothing but a keyboard and a clear understanding of how systems worked. Her name became a cautionary tale, a reminder. In the old military, rank and bluster could intimidate people into silence. But in the new military, the one built on information and technology, competence was the only currency that mattered. And Anna Sharma had just demonstrated that she was richer than any general. Back at FOB Sentinel, the culture had shifted. Thorne's replacement was a cyber warfare specialist, someone who understood that the technical experts weren't a drain on resources. They were the future. The term lab rat disappeared from conversations. The quiet professionals of units like Sharma's were now given the respect they'd always deserved. One afternoon, she was back at her facility recalibrating equipment for an upcoming deployment. The work was intricate, requiring steady hands and absolute focus. The door opened. She didn't look up. "Chief." It was Major Calloway, one of Thorne's former staff officers. She'd seen him laughing at Thorne's jokes in the dining facility that day. She continued her work, waiting. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice quiet. "For my part in all that, I stood by. I wrote reports defending what happened. I knew it was wrong, but I told myself I was just following orders." She made a final adjustment with a pair of tweezers. A green diagnostic light blinked on. "What you did," he continued, "the way you handled everything, it taught a lot of us a lesson about what real strength actually looks like." He held out something, a circular patch, his unit insignia. "I don't know what the protocol is for this, but I wanted you to have it." As a sign of respect, she finally looked up, studied his face. She saw genuine remorse there, something broken and then rebuilt. She reached up and detached the dark phoenix emblem from her own sleeve. The faith in the antennas patch, she held it out to him. He looked stunned. "You don't have to, the exchange is mutual," she said simply, "or it means nothing." He carefully took her patch like it was something sacred, then placed his on her workbench. They stood there for a moment in silence. Two people from different worlds of warfare, acknowledging each other. "Thank you, Chief," he whispered. Then he left. She picked up his infantry patch, looked at it for a moment, then placed it in a small clear box on her desk, a collection of tokens from others who had learned the same lesson. She turned back to her work. The apology was logged, the ritual complete, time to focus on the mission. A week later, she received another summons, this time to Admiral Vance's office on the Vigilance, now docked in port. He was waiting in his cabin. The room was quiet, just the gentle creak of the ship against its moorings. "Anna," he said, using her first name. "Sit." She sat. He poured 2 glasses of water, slid one across the table to her. "The ripple effects from our exercise are still spreading," he said. The Navy is completely rethinking its security protocols. The other services are taking notice. You didn't just win a war game, you forced an evolution. That was not the primary objective, Admiral, she stated simply. I know, Vance said with a small smile. The primary objective was a lesson in institutional integrity, and it was well learned. Thorne's court-martial is complete. He was found guilty, stripped of a star, forced into early retirement. He leaned forward. I've reviewed your full file, the real one. The number of times you've been underestimated, dismissed, harassed by senior officers who couldn't grasp what you do, it's a pattern. And in every case you responded the same way, quiet, documented, precise. You never lost your temper. Never broke protocol, you just let the facts speak. Sharma remained silent, listening. Most people would have become bitter, Vance continued, or they would have quit, but you just keep working, keep focusing on the mission. Why? She considered the question, her gaze distant as if scanning some invisible spectrum. The system is logical, she said finally. Its rules are based on principles of order and evidence. People are the random variable. They introduce noise, ego, emotion. When the noise becomes disruptive, it must be filtered. When rules are broken, they must be enforced. The goal isn't to punish the person. It's to recalibrate the system back to its logical state. She paused. Restraint is the most efficient way to govern power. It allows the variable to expose its own flaws. Vance stared at her, then nodded slowly. He understood now. She saw the entire world, even the chain of command, as a complex system. Her job was to ensure it ran according to its own best principles. She wasn't a warrior in the traditional sense. She was a guardian of the logic that held everything together. Your next assignment is ready, he said, sliding another folder across the table. Deep-sea cable monitoring. We have indications an adversary has developed a method of tapping hardened fiber optic lines at extreme depths. Your unique skill set makes you the only person qualified to lead the response. She opened the folder, bathymetric charts, signal latency graphs, schematics for deep submergence vehicles. Her eyes scanned the data, already absorbing, already identifying patterns. The Thorne incident was a closed file, an archived memory. The next mission was loading. She closed the folder and stood. I'll need my team and a fully calibrated anechoic tank within 48 hours. You'll have it, Vance said, standing as well. He looked at her, at the quiet, formidable strength contained in her small frame. She was the future of warfare, a future many weren't ready for. Good hunting, Chief. She nodded once, turned toward the door. Just before she left, she paused, looked back at him. Correction was achieved, she said. Then she was gone, leaving only the quiet hum of the ship, the faint scent of ozone in her wake, a ghost already moving on to the next puzzle, the next system in need of calibration. Back at Sentinel, life continued, but something fundamental had changed. Not just in how people treated technical specialists, but in how they understood power itself. Thorne had believed power came from rank, from the ability to intimidate, to control through fear and bluster. Sharma had shown them something different. Power came from competence, from the ability to see patterns others missed, to document truth so precisely it became undeniable, from the restraint to let the system correct itself rather than forcing correction through anger. In the months that followed, her name became a reference point. When junior officers were tempted to abuse their authority, someone would mention the Sharma incident. When technical experts were dismissed or overlooked, someone would remind the room what happened to the last person who made that mistake. She became a legend, but legends have a funny way of obscuring the truth. People started telling the story like it was about revenge, about a woman who destroyed a general's career, but that wasn't what happened. What happened was simpler and far more powerful. A senior officer violated the regulations he was sworn to uphold. A warrant officer documented that violation, and the system, when given irrefutable evidence, did exactly what it was designed to do. It enforced its own rules. Sharma didn't destroy Thorne, she simply held up a mirror, and he destroyed himself. Years later, young intelligence officers going through training would study the incident, not as a cautionary tale about workplace harassment, but as a masterclass in documentation, chain of custody, and the proper use of institutional channels. They would analyze her report, her evidence gathering, her decision to bypass the compromised base command structure and go directly through her unit's secure channel. It became a teaching case. A perfect example of how to handle a bad situation with precision and professionalism. But what they rarely taught, what couldn't be captured in a training manual, was the emotional truth at the heart of her actions. Anna Sharma wasn't driven by revenge. She was driven by something quieter, a belief that systems, when properly calibrated, could be fair, that rules, when properly enforced, could protect the vulnerable. That competence, when properly documented, could speak louder than any amount of bluster. She had faith, not in people, but in the process. In the idea that if you did everything correctly, if you followed every regulation, if you documented every fact, the system would eventually recognize the truth. Most people would say that's naive, that institutions are built to protect the powerful, that someone like Thorne, with his connections and his decades of service, would always win. But they would be wrong. Because Sharma understood something they didn't. Institutions aren't monolithic. They're made up of individuals. And while some of those individuals are corrupt, many are simply trying to do their jobs, trying to maintain order, trying to enforce the rules they were given. All they need is the right information, presented in the right way. Through the right channels. That's what she gave them, not a complaint, not an accusation, just facts, irrefutable, time-stamped, multi-angle, encrypted, archived. The kind of evidence that removes all doubt, the kind that forces action. And the system responded exactly as it was designed to. Not because anyone particularly liked her, not because anyone felt sorry for her, but because the evidence was so overwhelming that ignoring it would have compromised the integrity of the entire command structure. She had weaponized institutional procedure. She had turned the system's own mechanisms against someone who thought he was above those mechanisms. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone that no one, regardless of rank, is above the regulations. There's something beautiful in that, something almost philosophical. In a world where power often comes from charisma, from connections, from the ability to bend rules and manipulate systems, she had found power in the opposite. In following rules so precisely they became unbreakable. In documenting truth so thoroughly it became undeniable. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. But it worked. And it changed everything. The morning after Thorne's sentencing, she was in her facility, running diagnostics on a new signals intelligence suite. The work was routine, methodical, exactly the kind of task she found meditative. A knock on the door, she didn't look up. Enter. It was a young specialist, fresh out of training. He looked nervous. "Chief, I just wanted to say, what you did, standing up to that general, it meant a lot to a lot of us." She continued her work. "I didn't stand up to anyone. I filed a report through proper channels. But you weren't afraid. Even when fear is irrelevant," she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "The regulations exist for a reason. When they're violated, they must be enforced. Personal feelings don't factor into the equation." The specialist stood there uncertain, wanting to say more but not knowing how. She finally looked up at him, saw the admiration in his young face. The way he was looking at her like she was some kind of hero, she almost smiled. "What's your specialty?" she asked. "Signals analysis, same as you, Chief." "Then let me tell you something important," she said, setting down her tools. "This job isn't about being brave, it's about being precise. Every day you're going to face signals you don't understand. Patterns that don't make sense. Pressure to report what people want to hear instead of what the data actually shows." She held his gaze. "Your job is to report the truth, exactly as you observe it. No embellishment, no interpretation beyond what the evidence supports. Because somewhere, someone is making life-or-death decisions based on your analysis. And if your analysis is compromised by ego or fear or the desire to please your superiors, people die." The specialist nodded slowly. "So it's not about standing up to authority, it's about serving the mission." "Exactly," she said. "Authority is temporary. The mission is permanent. Never confuse the two." He left looking thoughtful, and she returned to her work. That conversation would repeat itself in various forms dozens of times over the years. Young officers seeking her guidance, asking her how she found the courage to stand up to a general, and every time she would give them the same answer. It wasn't about courage. It was about competence, about understanding your role in the system and executing it with precision, about having faith that if you do your job correctly, the system will do its job too. Some would call that blind faith. Some would say she was lucky that her chain of command supported her, that in another unit under another admiral her report might have been buried, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. The system isn't perfect. It doesn't always work, but she had learned something important. The system works more often when you understand it completely, when you know every regulation, every procedure, every channel. When you document everything so thoroughly that ignoring your evidence would require deliberate corruption, not just negligent oversight. That's what most people missed. She didn't just file a complaint. She built a case. Airtight, multi-sourced, impossible to dismiss without exposing everyone who tried to dismiss it. She had made ignoring her report more dangerous than acting on it. That was the real lesson, not that justice always prevails, but that justice prevails when you make it impossible for people to look away. When you turn truth into something so bright, so well documented, so precisely presented that even those who want to ignore it can't. That's power. Not the power to make things happen, but the power to make things undeniable. The power to turn facts into forces, data into decisions, evidence into enforcement. In the end, Thorne didn't lose because she was strong. He lost because she was thorough. He didn't fall because she fought back. He fell because she documented everything and let the regulations do what regulations are supposed to do. There's dignity in that. A quiet dignity that doesn't need speeches or grand gestures. The dignity of someone who trusts the process enough to follow it completely. Who believes that truth, when properly preserved and presented, is its own form of justice. Years later, when she retired after 2 decades of service, there was no ceremony, no speeches, no medal presentation. That's not how her branch worked. She simply finished her last assignment, filed her final report, and walked out of her facility for the last time. But her influence remained. In the regulations that were updated because of her documentation methods, in the training programs that used her case as an example, in the hundreds of young specialists who learned from her that competence is the truest form of strength, and in the culture shift she had helped create. A culture where technical experts were respected, not mocked, where evidence mattered more than rank, where the quiet professionals who dealt in information were recognized as the backbone of modern warfare. She never sought recognition, never wanted to be a symbol, but symbols aren't chosen. They're created, through actions, through choices, through the accumulation of small, precise decisions that, when viewed together, reveal a pattern, a philosophy, a way of being. Her pattern was simple: trust the system, follow the rules, document everything, let the facts speak, and never ever let ego or emotion compromise the mission. It sounds simple, but simplicity is deceptive. In practice, it required absolute discipline, complete emotional control, the ability to face humiliation, anger, even violence, and respond not with equivalent force but with documentation. That's harder than fighting back, harder than making speeches, harder than any dramatic gesture. It's the hardest thing in the world, actually, to be struck, to be mocked, to be dismissed, and to respond with nothing but facts. No anger, no hurt, no need for vindication, just the cold, precise application of institutional procedure. That's what made her extraordinary. Not her technical skills, though those were impressive. Not her intelligence, though that was formidable, but her restraint. Her ability to see past the immediate emotional response and focus on the systemic solution. Her faith that if she did everything correctly, the outcome would take care of itself. And she was right. Most of the time, anyway. There were cases where the system failed her. Times when her reports were buried, her evidence ignored, her expertise dismissed. But even then, she never lost faith in the process. She just documented the failures and moved on to the next mission, because the mission was always more important than any individual slight. The system was always bigger than any personal grievance. That perspective is rare. Most people, when wronged, focus on the wrong itself, on the person who committed it, on getting even or getting closure. But she focused on the system, on identifying why the wrong occurred, on adjusting the procedures to prevent it from happening again. She treated human failure the way she treated signal noise, as data, as evidence of a systemic flaw that needed correction, not with anger but with analysis. That's why she won. Not because she was the strongest or the angriest or the most wronged, but because she was the most precise, the most thorough, the most systemically aware. She understood that real power isn't about individual victories, it's about system-level corrections. About changing the environment so that the next person doesn't face what you faced, so that the next violation is harder to commit, the next abuse harder to hide. She was playing a different game than everyone else. They were thinking about individual battles. She was thinking about institutional evolution, and that made all the difference. On her last day, she cleaned out her desk, packed up her personal effects, turned in her security credentials. No one made a speech. No one organized a going-away party. That's not what she would have wanted. Instead, a few people stopped by, colleagues, students, people whose careers she had influenced. They didn't say much, just thanked her, shook her hand, exchanged patches, the quiet rituals of military respect. And then she walked out into a civilian world that would never fully understand what she had done, never appreciate the battles she had fought, because her battles were invisible, fought in code and documentation and the precise application of regulations. The world celebrates loud heroes, the ones who give speeches, who stand on principles, who fight dramatic battles with clear winners and losers. But the real heroes, the ones who actually change systems, are almost always quiet. They work in the background, documenting, analyzing, building cases, following procedures. They don't need applause, they don't need recognition, they just need the system to work. And when it doesn't, they need the discipline to keep trying, to keep documenting, to keep believing that eventually, with enough evidence, the truth will become undeniable. That was Anna Sharma's gift, not her technical skills, not her courage, but her faith in a system most people had given up on. Her belief that institutions, for all their flaws, could still enforce justice, if you just knew how to use them correctly. She never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir, never tried to capitalize on her story because it was never about her, it was about the principle. The idea that competence should matter more than charisma, that evidence should matter more than ego, that rules properly applied could protect everyone equally. That idea is under attack every day, in every institution, in every organization, by people who believe that power comes from personality, from connections, from the ability to bend rules and intimidate subordinates. People like Thorne, who thought his rank and his ribbons and his years of service meant he could do whatever he wanted. People who measure strength in volume, who mistake cruelty for discipline, who see restraint as weakness. She proved them wrong, not with speeches or protests, but with facts, with process, with the quiet, devastating application of institutional procedure. And in doing so, she left a legacy. Not a legacy of individual triumph, but a legacy of systematic correction, of a culture shifted, of future Anna Sharmas who would know when faced with abuse or dismissal that they had tools, that the system, when properly engaged, could work. That competence, when properly documented, was its own form of power. That's the lesson. That's the moral. Not that good always triumphs, not that justice is guaranteed, but that when you do everything right, when you follow every regulation, when you document every fact, when you trust the process completely, the system can work, should work, must work. And when it doesn't, you keep fighting, not with anger, not with drama, but with precision, with evidence, with the quiet faith that truth, properly preserved, is its own form of justice. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, and then it lets the evidence do the rest.